Welcome. I'm honoured to have you here with me and delighted that you care enough to be here and that you've taken the time to consider that price of sensitivity in regard to the well-being of actors. And what possibly attracted you to this webinar was this question: as an actor, do I need both the heart of a dove and the hide of a rhinoceros? Well, when I was in acting school, this wasn't a question, it was an expectation. We were told that as professional actors, we would need to, and in fact should have, both the heart of a dove and the hide of a rhinoceros. Of course, these two juxtaposed metaphors are to get us thinking about what acting is about. After all, acting is about being open and vulnerable, saying yes and the career of acting needs to somehow also be tough enough to handle the rejections, to not take it personally, to get over the setbacks, perhaps ignore the bullying and the harassment that comes with the territory. But at least in my drama school, and from what I can tell from the many interviews and surveys I've done with actors, we were never taught how to hold these two ways of being in our own selves, this vulnerability and this toughness. And if you stop to think about it, these metaphors are really more about animals than about human beings. In fact, the Australian Actors Wellbeing Survey, among the almost 300 detailed responses we had from actors about the challenges of managing vulnerable roles, there was one comment that struck me. One actor spoke of acting in this way: we're meant to get out there and do it and be a bit superhuman. And that is at the core of what I want to address right now: sensitivity as a purportedly occupational hazard of actors. Because I take sensitivity and vulnerability very seriously. I love this image of skin that reminds me of the delicacy of our flesh, or what covers our flesh, but also the permeability of it. And I consider these qualities of sensitivity and vulnerability essential, not just to acting, but to being a human being. While sensitivity and vulnerability certainly open us up to harm, they also essentially enable us to live and respond. There are many who try to minimize vulnerability in our society. There are those who equate vulnerability, in fact, as a weakness to be guarded against. And I think that they are doing us a great disservice in trying to push us to be more than human, like superhumans. Such ideas can lead us to doubt the innate value and gift of our vulnerability that is our humanness. So, why am I so passionate about vulnerability? Well, for a period of about 7 years, which itself was over 28 years ago, I found myself in a marriage relationship experiencing an unhealthy dynamic of vulnerability between myself and my wife that really cost both myself and my partner very deeply. Over our years together, I encountered increasingly frequent, unexplainable expressions of rage and desperation towards me that escalated to even physical and emotional violence, causing me sometimes to become homeless. But I always returned to the relationship thinking perhaps I could fix it. And I was also too ashamed to tell my family and friends of this destructive dynamic that was causing both my partner and I to spiral downwards. And that was in spite of various psychotherapeutic interventions. But after finally leaving that dysfunctional relationship and in subsequently learning how to recover from that very traumatizing time, I now know a deeper appreciation of vulnerability that I rejoice in and that I continue to be grateful for. That's why in my research into vulnerability, particularly as it applies to creative professionals, I've really had to sort out how can I now be genuinely vulnerable which I define as that capacity to affect and be affected by the other, whether it's a play or a text or music or a person. How can I be vulnerable without allowing myself to be seriously wounded, harmed, or broken as I once was? Now, I do understand why teachers advocate the need for a tough skin, like that of rhinoceros. But in my life's journey and investigation, I have found that there is actually a different path that we can follow. This is a path of vulnerability that honors the value of choosing boundaries, clear yet generous boundaries towards what may cause injury, and maintaining the potential to affect and be affected, rather than getting safe, but finding oneself stuck behind impermeable barriers. I believe we can preserve the permeability of our innate vulnerability without having to try and build and maintain walls. So I'm grateful to share this and thrilled to talk about some of the good outcomes that have emerged from my research. Through developing this new engagement with vulnerability and healthy boundaries, many actors and other creative performers have found healing and indeed liberation. This presentation won't be replayed, so I do encourage you to take notes if that helps you keep track of the 3 traps that actors get caught up in. And while this webinar is primarily for actors, if you're an acting teacher or someone who cares about the well-being of actors, I'm sure this will help you support those actors as well. Now, I've identified 3 significant myths that have circulated in the industry for a long time. So here's why you need to pay close attention to each of them as I analyze them in turn, starting with myth number 3, that acting is only a fiction. In this myth, I think you'll need to pay attention to because it can trap you into not making your acting choices with care. And if you make choices carelessly, it can impact not only you, but also those significant relationships in your life. Myth number 2 is that you're blocked or I'm blocked and you or I need to be broken. Now, this needs serious attention because many teachers and directors who attempt to fix this apparent problem can end up doing significant psychological harm to the so-called blocked actor. Blocking is a symptom. It's not the core issue, so we need to attend to that core issue instead. And finally, myth number 1, you have to suffer for your art. This is probably the myth you're most familiar with. And I must say that as I speak with creative arts educators around the world, this is the myth that they most frequently are trying to challenge, question in their students, because this myth continues to be so pervasive and destructive. We absolutely need to break this romantic preoccupation with the martyr-like creative. Now, in the time I have with you, I can only go so far with both explaining the significance of each myth and offering some first incremental steps to challenge each myth and start to break free. So if you're provoked by this need to learn new ways of being creative in a healthily vulnerable way, I strongly encourage you to seek that out, that longer term education and training wherever you can find it, whether it's from me or anyone else you come across who shares values that affirm well-being as ethically essential to creative expression. So I'd love you to commit here and now to whatever advances both your creative capacity and your resilience in your vulnerability as an actor. Understanding why restoring value and respect for our innate human vulnerability, I think, is crucial. This is particularly as we unravel the various industry myths that can ignore or even tamper with that vulnerability. Because I believe we need to firstly relish our creative expression, while at the same time we cherish our significant relationships, and in that process, in the larger world, we can champion personal, relational, and social well-being. So not only may you need this, but also it may be that other significant people in your life need you to need this. And I believe this world can be blessed by valuing this. So if this is valuable, why is it not more present? There are ways of thinking that have caused me and may cause you to hesitate about all this, to think this is a bit different, or this is weird, or this might be wrong. So I want to acknowledge and draw our attention briefly to some of the dominant attitudes or objections that I've had to face and that you will probably face when you accompany me along this new path. Probably the toughest attitude shift that I had to make, and this took some time, was that embracing of healthy vulnerability seems selfish. I had to continually commit to a choice that I was no longer going to continue the habit of giving myself away in some reckless, heroic manner. This is not selfishness. This is where clear yet permeable boundaries apply, that I need to look after myself first. And a common objection that I faced from some industry professionals and teachers as I began advocating for actor well-being was this idea that self-care would result in safe performances, which was really implying weak performances. What I think they didn't appreciate is that I'm not advocating risk aversion. What I am advocating is risk management. In fact, I see this teaching will enable actors to be truly resilient risk takers. Finally, when we want to change from something that has been natural and habitual for us, it's not surprising we will encounter internal and maybe even relational resistances as we try out new ways of being and creating in the world. So change will need often small experimental steps that don't rock the boat too much while we build up alternative skill sets that enable these new values. As I mentioned, I've had a long habitual history of a willingness to just give myself away, to not stand by my own experiences and beliefs, because that seemed to make me more acceptable if I didn't clash with what other people thought or said or did with me. But that martyr-like quality over time squashed my spirit, even though I seemed to belong and fit in. And I now recognize that the unwillingness to own and speak up for my own pain and my own sense of joy actually did deplete and disempower me. But I also reflect back as I left that marriage that a part of my healing and recovery was nurtured by re-engaging with choral singing. This is me here, in case you can find me. In much earlier years, this activity of choral singing is what always brought me great joy, pleasure, and playfulness. So several years later in my doctoral research, I also grappled with what might be a way I could also nurture a sense of recovery and re-empowerment after traumatization and overwhelm for actors. And in fact, I was approached by some actors who were increasingly wary of roles that left them feeling drained and disconnected. So my coaching began to help them identify and make regular time for activities that, like me, fed their sense of joy and pleasure and playfulness. In addition, I'd also offer them some simple forms from a creative practice known as interplay, so that if they didn't have something for themselves, these forms could substitute and be a source of playfulness and joy. Now, one actor coming out of significant disconnection found such coaching advice and these playful practices very healing and liberating, sharing, I can now think more positively, and as a result of our work together, I can positively say that the psychological bruising is a thing of the past. So this journey of observing, researching, testing, and remaining playful with various creative challenges and apparent obstacles in creative professional work and well-being, all that has been my life's work over the past 15 years. And as an ongoing expression of that work, for example, I've been privileged to run a workshop in 2012 for the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama, their actor training and coaching master's program, where one student shared, I think what really stayed with me was the idea of vulnerability as a transformative process, rather than something that needs to be avoided and fought against. And since our body is in constant flow, vulnerability as a process, as something that flows and changes, makes perfect sense. And I've also been a keynote speaker on vulnerability and performance at a national puppetry conference where one participant shared, we need to work towards a more resilient and sustainable practice that enables us to have a vulnerable rhythm on stage and connection with the audience. I felt a holistic clearing from the exercises. I felt after the workshop a re-energizing and a calmness. So I'm excited by these experiences and responses to the work that I've done. This work is possible, and you can do this, even if at times you might feel still a bit trapped by old attitudes and habits. What I find is that the wonderful thing about our vulnerable bodies is that they tell us when things are no longer working, when in fact we need to make a change. And if you're on this webinar, that's possibly why you're here and ready to take those next small incremental steps. So let's now dive into the third of these three myths that keep actors trapped so we can take those steps towards freedom. So with myth number 3, that acting is only a fiction, let me describe first some of the symptoms that you might be experiencing that I would suggest indicate that you're unconsciously affected by this myth. I wonder, do you find yourself going through a rehearsal process and you're starting to take on the vocal qualities and speech patterns of your character, even finding yourself using various phrases or idioms of the character in your everyday speech? I know one play I did by Harold Pinter, I found myself starting to speak with a kind of Pinteresque expression quite away from the rehearsal process. Or do you find yourself after rehearsal and after performances or shooting days carrying home some of the feelings and thought patterns of the character, feeling a growing connection and empathy for the way a character sees the fictional world and other significant fictional relationships? Well, of course, you may reply. That's what acting is so much about, finding the life of the character, bringing the written page to life, embodying and finding empathy for the character's actions and desires, no matter how morally or socially questionable they may be. And I fully understand that response. However, I want you to note how much that embodied experience of preparing for and executing performance is actually removed from this contrasting belief that acting is a fiction, which implies that it's intangible, it's not real, it's pretend, it's just make-believe. So I hope you see that we're very clearly established that the craft of acting is actually all about embodiment. Yes, it is informed by imagination and make-believe, but still crucially, it is formative of the actor's body, emotions, imagination, cognitive ability, perceptions, and even relationships. So what might be a metaphor that reinforces this myth? Well, it's often commonplace to think of the actor as an instrument, or at least think of his or her body, mind, voice, and emotional capacity as the instrument. Now, the problem I find with this metaphor is that if we consider the actor as an instrument, then that can imply that the instrument can play whatever music it likes without it impacting the shape or the structure of the instrument. The instrument, of course, can be highly versatile, but it remains essentially unchanged by the work it performs. This, however, is not the case with many of the actors that I have met or interviewed, and it is not the experience of the nearly 300 actors who reported significant, sometimes life-altering and relationship-deteriorating changes as a result of embodying violent or dysfunctional or troubled characters and story scenarios. The consequences of failing to acknowledge and recognize the myth that acting is only a fiction are threefold. Firstly, if we believe that fictions don't really impact us, then I think we'll tend to disregard the content and the context of the role that we're seeking to genuinely and authentically embody. We may not care how much it shapes us in ways that actually subsequently create distress for us and those close to us. Secondly, we may find ourselves surprised, unprepared, and possibly overwhelmed by the power that words and imagination can have on our thoughts, emotions, and embodied experiences as we seek to create a character and a set of circumstances that seem believable and real. In actuality, the fiction necessarily becomes real. And that's why we all tend to cognitively suspend disbelief when we watch a play or a movie, so that our innate vulnerability can be engaged. We can be entertained and indeed moved by a story. It may be fiction, but there are still real biological and neurological changes that occur in the body in response to such fictions. And thirdly, our failure to comprehend the powerful shaping of our embodied experiences and perceptions by fictional circumstances and characters, this can result in us becoming reactive towards our real world peers, friends, and family. We may find ourselves reacting first and only in hindsight recognize that it was the character in us that was responding to those circumstances. So this value in deconstructing this myth has important value not just for our own well-being, but also has impacts on our workplace and with our other significant relationships. So in breaking free of this first myth, it doesn't happen overnight, but you can start to experience new ways of consciously testing and challenging this myth that will bring greater release over time. A key element in consciously acknowledging the powerful informational qualities of creating character is, I believe, to introduce to your sense of embodiment in your daily acting practice ways that you can playfully X-form characterization. And this is without creating that anxiety that you may not be able to take on that character shape again. I believe that by teaching your body to both welcome and release shaping, you honor the power of fiction in shaping experience rather than believing it's only a fiction. You are much more than an instrument. You are a remarkably versatile, sensitive, and imaginatively vulnerable human being. So let's honor and celebrate that. Now, one tool I love to share with actors that has provided a simple and importantly playful way to X-form on a regular basis, whatever it is that the body needs to X-form without words, is what in interplay is known as a hand dance, which over time can become, in fact, a full body dance. Now, I only can briefly describe this form to you now, but if you take up the program, you'll have a more comprehensive experience and training in this. So it would involve either sitting comfortably on a chair or lying comfortably on your back on the floor with your eyes closed, easy breath, and lifting one hand above you or in front of you, just making various movements, starting with smooth movements and then jerky movements and then slow movements and then fast movements, and just exploring all the different ways that you can move with that hand and arm, and then holding a shape in stillness and making another shape without planning it, and then making contact with your body and just being aware of all these possibilities of movement, shape, and stillness that you have. And then you can play for yourself a piece of instrumental music that you've pre-selected, and that you can let yourself then just move either with or against the flow of that music, and perhaps even let a question or something that's lingered from a rehearsal arise in you, and let the movement interact with that question, those feelings in its own way, and just keep breathing. And at the end of it, having another time of stillness, having that dance, and then perhaps either journaling for yourself what you noticed, in particularly looking for the good. And if you're with another, if others are doing this experience for themselves, perhaps you can share your experiences. So let's now move to myth number 2, this idea that you're blocked or I'm blocked and that you or I need to be broken. And I'd like to again describe some of the symptoms that you might be experiencing in relation to this myth. Perhaps obviously, because the myth speaks of a sense of blocking or being blocked, there is a sense of stuckness or lostness or disconnection, or even a perceived lack of flow or energy or vitality. Not surprisingly, such feelings will create a sense of tension and anxiety in the process of rehearsal and performance, because, as I've highlighted already, that's the dynamic openness is in fact what we want audiences to experience. And as audiences, that's what we want to experience, that dynamic openness and connectedness. We want to witness the vulnerability and the interactivity of actors with each other and with the unfolding drama being portrayed and enacted. If there isn't any evidence of persons affecting and being affected in this way, if there isn't a palpable sense of vitality, flow, and connection, and that's even if it simulates disconnection and relational dysfunction within the context of the play, if there isn't this sense of connection, then we would say the drama isn't working. And we might conclude that something or someone is stuck, something is blocking the flow. Now, a possible metaphor for this experience could be the actor as a machine. Now, it is less commonplace to think of the actor as a machine, although the Russian theatre director and acting innovator Meyerhold certainly conjured a notion of actor as a kind of efficient machine. His system of biomechanics took some influence from the time and motion studies of Frederick Winslow Taylor in the early 20th century. But my particular application of this mechanistic metaphor is that it reinforces the notion that the actor needs to function as a machine, that the acting machine either works, gets broken down, gets repaired and rebuilt so it works, or gets thrown out and replaced by another actor machine that does work and keeps things flowing along efficiently. However, actors are not machines. They are human beings who have a giftedness and a capacity to act. So they should not be treated like machines or expected to behave like machines. The consequences of reacting to the actor as though he or she was blocked like a machine and needs fixing are twofold. Firstly, I find that actors are often frequently encouraged, some might say bullied, or even shamed into pushing through whatever this block might be perceived to be. They are told to get over whatever is causing them to hesitate to take that risk. They are told to expose themselves, to let it all out, to go for broke. And I think it should be noted that sometimes the perception of the block may reside with an audience or a director rather than with the actor. This, in fact, raises a related issue of whose perception overrules and on what grounds. For what if members of an audience or a director are insensitive to or wary of becoming vulnerable themselves as part of this necessary unspoken contract of shared vulnerability between audiences and performances? So in fact, it may not be the actor who is blocked, but it might be the director or the audience member who is blocked. And secondly, if actors either feel blocked or are told they're blocked or blocking their interaction with a fellow actor, the fix is seen as to often break the actor down. The block, the resistance to a deeper vulnerability, is regarded as a pathological problem that requires some cathartic intervention of breaking down barriers until the person experiences some apparent emotional release. This pathologizing of perceived blocks and barriers runs, I believe, counter to what many psychologists and psychotherapists regard as an appropriately healthy functioning of the human body and psyche, that it needs to ensure it can manage disruptions and perceived threats to its well-being and, in fact, its survival. Now, I personally have witnessed the need to move very carefully and cautiously into exposing any past wounds that may still be in need of healing, especially when a current sense of instability could be the most unwise time to expose additional past vulnerabilities. And I've also directly encountered and have read of accounts of actors, particularly those in training, being significantly traumatized by well-meaning yet misguided attempts at removing or disrupting aspects of wounding and caution. What they saw as blocks within an actor were things that actually needed respect, care, and compassion before some new flow and reconnection could be coaxed and nurtured. Now, many of these actors in training that were thus re-traumatized and broken left the profession, and I think were unfairly written off for not having what it takes. So, to break free from this myth number 2 that you're blocked, again, this doesn't happen overnight, but you can start to experience new ways, again, of consciously testing and challenging this myth that will bring greater release over time. So here are 2 parallel factors to explore and ask yourself. Firstly, is the sense of blockage primarily internal? Is it a lack of feeling? Or is it something that moves between bodies, a lack of shared connection? Because in either case, patience is required to attend to where this perceived blockage might become more apparent, so that we know where to encourage stillness and receptivity and a gentle, patient listening to what is needed to create a safe space to open up, whether it's for the actor or for the director or an audience. Now, it should also be noted that an internal block or barrier is actually the body's way of saying, I've been wounded and I need to know if it's safe again. For several years after my repeated experiences of violence and traumatization, I was often surprisingly hypervigilant. I was super sensitive and reactive to places and smells and other triggers that would remind me of earlier woundings and indeed betrayals of safety. While becoming open again was a great relief, I did need to know that I was the person determining how and when I'd be ready to welcome such vulnerability back into my life. And finally, the number 1 myth is that you must suffer for your art. Now, the primary symptoms of this myth are evident in how actors either see or are encouraged to see any moments of pain and struggle of experiences in their own real lives as something they need to hold on to, trying to savor and linger in such moments so that when they play a character in a similar state, they can call upon those personal experiences. Now, they also tend to avoid or minimize any entering into any significant relaxing, joyous, or pleasurable experiences, just in case, I've been told, that they might lose that edge, that angst that they need to access quickly to fulfill their acting commitments. And this is not only a myth, I think, for actors, it's a dominant myth in many creative professions: painters, composers, singers, dancers, writers. And I think it's the metaphor that it is that similar to that of the actor as a martyr or being a martyr, that the person seeking to suffer for their art and craft is often there in the belief that suffering produces the best, the most authentic and heartfelt artistic outcomes. And it can be highly tempting for the general public to applaud and reinforce this romantic belief that the best art comes from those who live recklessly, painfully, and die too young. Now, of course, we can identify amazing works by those who died too young, but that is a price I don't think we should be asking them to pay. So the consequences of living the life of a martyr as an actor are twofold. Firstly, the preoccupation of the actor to dig deep into pain and to linger in discomfort and angst can actually begin to normalize such experiences and in fact create a tolerance, a kind of deadening of sensation where they feel pain at one level and then they feel it so much that they no longer feel it with the quality they used to. So they then seek a higher level of pain to reawaken them. So this increased tolerance to pain at one level requires and actually seeks out more intense, traumatizing experiences in order to arouse the feelings that were triggered by earlier pains. And secondly, the seeking out of anguishing experiences in preference to pleasurable and even joyous life experiences, especially those shared with significant others, can result in isolation from everyday life. Real life can seem less dramatic and real than the scripted and heightened dramas of stage and screen. So, how might we break free of this myth number one, that you must suffer for your art? Actually, this is one of the trickiest ones to attend to and break free from, but it is the most important. So liberation number one, you don't have to suffer for your art to create art that is valuable and meaningful. As I said, if I'm asked to choose between art that is produced by an artist who can manage both the joys and pains of life and can feel connected to significant others, can feel connected to a broader community, and in fact, because they're able to manage their life, can continue to produce art, I'm asked to choose between that and art that has cost the creative person his own or her own well-being, their sanity, and their treasured close relationships. I would much rather have the former. For me, human lives matter more than artistic expression produced by highly distressed and isolated creatives who become or end up being self-destructive. So liberation number two is that although you don't have to suffer for your art, because you choose to honor your innate vulnerability and you choose to value your significant relationships, you may indeed suffer in your art. Therefore, you will need to learn how to care for your sensitivity so undue pain doesn't become tolerated or normalized. And you don't want to be so overwhelmed by pain and discomfort that you feel you must numb that pain with drugs, alcohol, or other forms of self-medication. And this is where having those wise, healthy boundaries comes in. And I'd like to draw upon the great wisdom of Dr. Brené Brown for this third point of liberation. She's a social worker and vulnerability researcher who found that joy is actually the most significant measure or indicator of our capacity for vulnerability. So we need to actively lean in to those experiences of joy that we encounter in life, really savor those experiences, looking for the good in those experiences and honoring those experiences with deep gratitude. So these are 3 steps towards freedom in countering the temptation towards artistic martyrdom that is so often equated with being a legitimate actor. So I've now defined here and identified 3 important myths that can keep actors trapped. And I've offered an initial shift in mindset or behavior for each myth that I believe can provide some initial liberation from the habits that can otherwise prove to be unsustainable. However, in my own ongoing research and work with actors, other questions have emerged that need further responses and practical action steps. For example, if I start to value and respect my own feelings rather than trying to fit in and belong all the time, what do I do when that vulnerability really hurts or I feel isolated because I've chosen to be truly myself? And how do I recover that quality of energy that I lost when I began to feel drained by playing all those intense roles? And if vulnerable openness isn't about being broken and having my resistances torn down, then how do I nurture a vulnerability that's more, shall we say, user-friendly and resilient with healthy boundaries? These are some of the questions that I address and offer practical responses in this new online course. Now, these questions might lead you to feel a bit overwhelmed. These might be questions that feel a bit unusual, but my program is designed to help actors avoid unnecessary confusion, time, and expense around these things, and to find rewarding and sustainable ways forward as both confident and competent actors. Now, the actors that I have coached have found such skills and insights rewarding for their own career development. One said, "I think that the process provides a safety net for exploring the complexity of how a traumatic character can affect an actor. It provides a space, spiritual, physical, and mental, to allow the character to be outworked and released." So this first online training program that I'm offering is called Recover Your Acting Power, because I argue that recovering your innate and valuable vulnerability is key to feeling whole and empowered as a professional actor. And it's a vulnerability that is consciously and wisely resilient. There are clear boundaries, so you don't need that tough hide of a rhinoceros. This program consists of 4 modules with online training. It's paced over 8 weeks, with also a live question and answer group coaching session every week, plus downloads of summary notes and also downloads of music to support the practical exercises, such as that hand dance that I shared with you earlier. Just like to say a bit more about the modules themselves. Module 1 is about restoring what slips away. You'll be restoring a grounded sense of personal and relational presence and a value of who you are and why you matter, so that you can know how to recall yourself back home whenever you become disoriented in the journey of acting. Module 2 is about resensitizing what feels numb. In this, you'll resensitize and reattune your whole self, reaching out with inquisitiveness and vulnerable openness, so that whenever you sense yourself withdrawing or shutting down, you can choose to negotiate again both the necessary self-care that's practicing those boundaries, with the necessary self-exposure and vulnerability that needs to connect with others. Module 3 is about revitalizing what lacks energy. You'll revitalize yourself so that whenever you sense yourself holding back or losing momentum, you can choose to breathe, vocalize, expand, and reclaim appropriate dynamic power. And then module 4 is about reconnecting to your creative work. You'll reconnect with both your acting craft and your creative partnerships, bringing courage to your vulnerable connections with the text, with the character, your fellow actors, your director, and importantly, the audience. And you'll also renegotiate trustful relationships that can support the acting gifts that you are now empowered to offer again and again. Now, because I want you to feel confident to try this course out if you're an actor and see if it works for you or not in your own particular unique embodiment, I've included a 30-day money-back guarantee so that you can trial the weekly practical exercises for a month. And as this is the premiere version 1.0 of this program, if you do sign up, I'll be wanting to ask for your weekly feedback as much as I'll be there to support you on what has been useful or not. And I'll be doing that in exchange for a one-time only discount of, in Australian dollars, 397, inclusive of GST. And that's the equivalent of 284 American dollars or 253 euros or 220 pounds, including VAT, in this year so far of 2019. So I really want to see actors confidently applying and celebrating their sensitivity and creative intelligence to create characters that they want to create without that anxiety about not knowing how to deal with possible overwhelm or traumatization. Because I believe it should be empowering for an actor to go to those dark places, to tell those powerful stories, and not have to numb themselves with alcohol or drugs to keep sane or just cope with the rest of the time between shows or between shooting days, as many actors have attested to. Such awareness and training would also give them more confidence to take on roles that they can manage, and also that they would know when to take time off to recover and restore themselves between roles so that they are always performance ready. So, to come to the conclusion of this, if you have any questions, I'll be happy to respond to them. But thanks for being with me on this webinar, and may I encourage you to enjoy being the human being you were created to be, and invite you to stay connected to life and love.